Right, welcome back, everyone. So this is just a follow-up to the excellent webinar we just had now, hosted by Peabody. As promised, we are going to go through the questions that we didn't have a minute to get through on the session, and we're going to answer your questions as best as we can. So Nikki, would you please kindly moderate for us and just read out the questions asked by the attendees, and all of us shall do our best to answer.
Of course. First question, what's the name of the regulation you just talked about?
So I can pick that up there. That was actually from Adam's session, I believe. And he had referenced at the beginning the 2012 Social Value Act, but then later was referencing the procurement bill currently going through UK Parliament, where the long name is A Bill to Make Provision About Procurement. It is available on the UK Parliament website if you just search procurement bill. That should show you originated in the House of Lords, session 22 to 23.
Thanks, Corin. Next question, how do you support social value with smaller businesses with lower contract values? And the same person asked, is there the same tender weighting there too? Who's got that one?
I will jump in quickly and just say at Southern, we take a very different approach to many of our housing associations. We still go down the route of having an open question where we target specific themes that we feel are most important in that particular community. So often they will look at addressing issues around fuel, food, technology and furniture poverty, mental well-being, health well-being, community and societal cohesion. And we asked the question around how would you look to address these and what kind of support would you specifically provide in addressing these issues. We would then take that approach, score them accordingly, and then the successful candidate, we will work with them to create a delivery plan which may address the things they put into their response, or work with them to come up with things that we think will be more reflective for that community that they're based in. So the great thing about social value is it's so long as you have a contractor buy-in, which I think it's from when I first started 9 years ago, that contractual buy-in for social value has grown massively. And I think as such, we can really do say that contractors are 90% of the time open to adapting and changing and delivering impactful social value now. So on an annual basis, I'm constantly reviewing and checking to make sure our social value is still relevant. So it's not just about the tender process, it's the journey you're on for the lifetime of that, the lifetime of that contract.
I think I would just add to that as well. Just to say, I think sometimes people worry that smaller organizations somehow will just automatically struggle just by the nature of their size. And I touched on earlier that for many of us, we've seen the exact opposite on a number of occasions, that often the ones that are small and agile, tend to be the ones more locked into grassroots organizations, kind of understand, they're more on the pulse of what's going on in those local communities. I mean, social enterprises, by their very definition, show that you can be small, but actually you can do a lot of social good. So for us, we do have the same expectations, I suppose, i.e. we have a kind of prescribed list of social value options. We do obviously allow flexibility within those options so people can still sort of suggest things. And we would use the value of the contract as a kind of guide to determine how much or how many of those things that a smaller organization would be able to select to do. But I think the key word there, and Raj, you mentioned it, is support. I think ultimately that's what it comes down to. I've had some massive organizations who don't even have a clue, actually, when it comes to social value delivery, and often need just as much support as some of the smaller ones. I think as long as we, the procuring organizations, are willing to ensure there is a strong support mechanism to be able to advise and guide throughout the duration of the contract, then the small as well as the large will thrive and be able to hit their targets.
Andrea, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree with the approach that Chi and Raj have discussed. And one of the things that we found in the trial, because we tested really on contracts above the UK procurement threshold, was really looking at, how we can put in place a really clear mechanism to develop those relationships with the smaller contractors and where relationships are managed at a very local level. And so it's really sort of, looking at each contract and, looking at which geographic area it covers, what's the contract value, and really looking at how we can build that very sort of localized relationship. And, the contractual obligations, they're just the starting point. We see the signing of the contract as the starting of, the starting point of a growing relationship with that supplier. But that's one of the areas that we're focusing on now within Peabody, is how we can make a very sort of localized ask on lower contract values and with smaller organizations. And we're testing this out with the HACS Social Value Insight tool at the moment.
Okay, Michael, your hand's up. You got anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo the points that the guys have made, but I think the kind of impact is probably quite a key thing to think about. So small organisations or organisations, and particularly close to grassroots, obviously at times can deliver higher impact outcomes. And I think that's, and I noticed in the chat during the main session that someone had said that. And I think the report I had in my presentation about the impact of social housing, one of the outcomes that we evidenced was that social housing organisations have the potential to play the role as community anchors, or can work with community anchor organisations to deliver these kind of programmes that create better social value. And I think it's about understanding who's best placed to deliver that. Now that's completely regardless of size. And actually what you often find is smaller place-based organisations are able to do that, as Chi Chi said, in a more agile fashion. Now, we're looking to deliver large programs. Large organisations obviously have that capacity. So I actually think it's more about, it's kind of agnostic of size and more about understanding who's the best players to deliver these programs. And I think, it'd be interesting to see, Andrea, some of the stuff from Social Value Insight, how that plays out and is evidenced, because I think actually having a tool and a mechanism to capture different social values from different partners as part of a project is a really interesting way to look at overall social value.
Okay, cool. Next question. Sometimes the broader economic and social objectives are overlooked in contract and in favour of local and contract-focused social value. That's not to say these initiatives do not produce meaningful outcomes, but how do organisations like yourselves strike a balance between defined outcomes and the autonomy to develop initiatives in contract?
Adam, I think you answered that question actually really, really well. In the first session, I wouldn't even add any more to that personally. It's just trying to meet in the middle. I think is that kind of key point you made. People appreciate that prescriptive element, either because they've never done it before, or even if they have done it before, it helps them to understand the expectations of the particular organisation with whom they're seeking a contract with. But then if you build in that ability for people to then add their own innovative flair to it, then you kind of get the best of both worlds. And I suppose there's always the possibility of having that additional question of, and would you do anything else in addition to, and seeing what else people come up with, but then going back to that whole evidence piece, and well, even before the evidence, how you're then going to score it, be very clear that you've kind of set yourself some very clear criteria as to how you're going to score some of these more open-ended, innovative responses, but then also the kind of evidence you're going to request for at the other end, post delivery as well. So I think that was a great answer. Adam, if I do say so myself.
Thank you. I'm afraid I've got to run to another meeting because I didn't know we were all meeting during this one. It's just about the integration of credit cards. So I do need to run off, I'm afraid. Apologies for that.
Bye, Adam. Okay, next question. This one's for Peabody. How much have you generated in monetary terms in social value, and how do you show the impact that it has on your communities? I mean, maybe everyone can answer it.
Should I take this one? So we've generated around 21 million of committed social value through the pilot phase, and that's over the next 4 years, and it's based on the TOMS proxy value, and it's been calculated using the social value portal platform. This is obviously a really incredible figure of committed social value, but really key is capturing the impact of this at an individual and community level rather than just, giving a purely quantitative figure. And we capture the impact in a range of different ways. Lots of case studies, sort of stories that bring the impact to life, you know, and what it's actually having at a very local level. We've got our PCF and Peabody Group annual reports. We're just about to publish our very first social value impact report. I think that's coming out this week. And this gives some detailed case studies, both at sort of supplier level, you know, individual level, and really does share the impact. We've also got a quite large scale impact and evaluation program, which captures all of PCF's impact. And we've got the University of Manchester as our evaluation partner. So there's a range of ways that we really capture the impact that it's actually having in our communities.
Anyone else want to say from their HA?
Feel rather pathetic following up with the 21 million pounds, to be honest. I mean, we're not as large as Peabody, but I think in the last few years, we've managed to achieve £250,000 worth of social value. That's what in terms of direct funding, where our supply chain helps support in the funding and delivery of projects, and in-kind social value, where our contractors and the supply chain go into the communities. We tend to measure true value, so it's literally the cost of delivering that social value. So it's, you know, we don't focus as much on impact at the moment. We are investigating, exploring the various ways to do that. I think the important thing to really look at is the case studies. It's working with the individuals or the community groups that have experienced the social value delivered and seeing what impact that's had on them. And generally, that's the approach Southern takes, is just working with those, capturing the stories, the impact that's had in the communities and on individuals. I think the impact assessment is an evolving door, and I think the journey is a young one. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll be looking back and thinking, was that really the way we did it? Because I think it's fascinating the way that the government, local authorities, private sector, charities, housing associations are all coming together to say, these are the things we quite like in capturing, you know, the impact information. These are the things I think we need to change and evolve on. So I think even a year from now, we'll be looking at things that are very different. And I think Michael and Nathan will have a big influence on that journey, as will other organisations. But I think focus on working with your contractors to do localised impact assessments, and that will be what would hold a true reflection of the story of social value.
Okay, Michael, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, huge points there. And I think obviously in terms of delivering actual monetary social value, it's not something that you know, we facilitate other people doing it. But I thought it's just an interesting thought that in some ways the social purpose of the housing sector has never been more needed. So the ability that you guys have to do that is absolutely massive. And I think some of the kind of the different ways you're approaching that, so focusing on both the procurement activities, but then through the life cycle of that contract and some of that wraparound service, actually just having an understanding of what the kind of varying outcomes are. I often think that we will never even get close to capturing the full comprehensive social value create, because you know the amount of indirect social values just from one tenancy is absolutely massive. But I think, you know, hearing some of Andrea's points about, you know, and particularly the numbers, it's really heartening to see that organisations are maturing and are able to collect more and more and understand the different outcomes in different areas. And actually, you know, yes, it's good to get good numbers, but it's more important to make that kind of transformational impact, which you guys are obviously doing.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think that's an important distinction, I would say, that Michael's just alluded to there. I think as housing associations, just by our inherent existence, or the inherent reason behind our existence, we exist to create social housing, affordable housing. And so we're already generating social value just from our kind of bread and butter services. But I think for most of us on the SVLG, we're looking beyond that. We're looking beyond the social value that comes from the homes we built, and we're looking at our supply chain. What more social value can we now generate through this relationship with our supply chain? We don't want it to just remain a transactional relationship. We pay you for these goods and services, you give us these goods and services, full stop. There's such a rich resource of expertise and knowledge and other resources that our supply chains hold that can actually be cracked open for the good of the communities that we are housing. And I think off the back of that, sometimes it can be difficult, and I'm going to be honest, when you're looking at social value generated from your supply chain, it's almost like just part of the story. So you can use things like Hacked, Social Value Bank, or the TOMs, etc. And you can say, just as a quick measure, this is how much social value we'll probably get from this contract based on these financial proxies from this impact measurement framework that we're using. But then there's the other side, and it's the evidence, and it's the the data to back it up, and so on and so forth. And not every organization has the resource to do that part. And I'm gonna be quite honest and open about it. So sometimes it is a question of that figure almost being indicative, because maybe you can't back it up by as much qualitative information as you'd like. And that's just the reality. I still think it's important to have that figure so that people again understand that this is the potential, at least the minimum impact that we feel we can generate from this particular contractual arrangement. But yeah, I think like Raj, quite a few people are still on a journey when it comes to how else or what more you're going to do to back up that impact figure that you've quoted, because otherwise it can just sort of sound like this big monopoly figure money. We've generated X trillions of pounds of social value, and it's just like, what does that mean? Without those qualitative case studies and testimonials, it doesn't really mean much, does it? So.
Okay, next question. Are there any templates or tools which can be shared to help buying organisations to develop and build in the right type of social value questions at tender stage?
We're going to make one, aren't we? The SVLG are already pulling together some tips and tricks based off of our experience. We're all pulled in, all of the social value leads on the SVLG are pulled in to evaluate the social value element of tenders, big and small. And we know what makes our eyes roll and the ones that get us excited. So we will pull together a bit of a kind of a summary or briefing doc to just support people to give better answers, not just answers for the sake of answers though, but to really think through what their offer is going to look like and ensure that it's a feasible one that they're going to be able to deliver on. We don't want lip service. That's what we don't want.
Absolutely. I mean, just a quick to add on to that for anyone who, because it may take us a few weeks or months to get that together. Biggest thing we will tell you all to do is don't cut and paste your responses. Read the question, understand the question, invest some time in responding to what we've actually specifically asked for. The worst responses are the ones where you've taken something from another tender document and plastered it in and not paid attention to what we've asked. Second thing I've really emphasised on is we'll look at the difference between Section 106 if it's a development contract and social value. They're two very distinct things. You know, as housing associations, people respond to those answers. We don't always like to see Section 106 built into the social value response because it seems like you're cheating the social value. So do pay attention to that because it's not welcomed.
Yeah.
Michael?
To add to that as well, I think it's interesting to think about the types of outcomes you're measuring for each of that. Some of them will be a binary, you've completed that, or you have a numbers. So it might be people going through programs, and where it's improving someone's kind of well-being or someone's quality of life. Actually, the requirement to have a before and after measurement is any part of the survey. So I think it's about having that understanding of the types of measurements and impact measures you're looking at. Because I think, based on our methodology, it's all about the improvement in well-being. So you do have to capture the before and after. So it is really key that when you think about what outcomes you're looking at, we have a range of surveys that give the direct questions. They come from those UK wellbeing surveys. So I think you have to ask them in a specific way, in a specific timings, so you can get that increase in measurement. So I think understanding that what type of outcomes, is it a perception or is it a kind of binary, yes, we've achieved that, is a fairly huge part of that too.
Yeah, being able to describe the change, the change that has taken place. So when you're making your offer, be ready to be able to explain, yeah, and this is how we know that we've made the change that we had hoped to see. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Michael.
Okay, next question. How do you strike a balance between cherry picking the best or highest scoring delivery and those that benefit but do not generate a high score on the matrix? Who wants that?
I'm happy
to say that again. Sorry.
How do you strike a balance between cherry picking the best or highest scoring delivery and those that benefit but do not generate a high score on the matrix?
I'm happy to take that and go back to, I think, the first point I made on the session, and it's about understanding what the need is in that area. And I think, we've all heard examples of people putting on large scale employability programs in an area that's almost exclusively over 65s. So actually, yes, the social value outcome of that would be huge, but actually that's not what people need. And it goes back to the point about smaller organisations. Actually, some of the smaller interventions you can make will have a bigger impact. So understanding what the local need is. So, and that's some open source data sets around, some of the kind of deprivation stats, but also some of the kind of satisfaction in your tenants. I think that's a real place to start with this one.
Corin?
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in there as well and say, in terms of the thought of possibly cherry picking something that produces a high value, I think one of the things that we've tried really actively to do is just to make sure that as we're scoring, we're weaving in both quantitative and qualitative considerations. So perhaps, yes, we see a high number, but then really picking that apart, what backs that up? I think that really harkens back to some of the points Rod was making. Does this seem suited locally? Is this well backed up? And frankly, is it plausible that this will be really great added value for our communities? So it's really just making that a bit more holistic of a scoring and assessment.
Yeah, I was exactly going to make that point, Corinne. I think
me too.
For those of you who are thinking about how we score as procuring organizations, we don't just look at it and say, oh, yeah, that calculates to the most. Yep, that's it. They're the winner, full stop. No, we absolutely do weave in all of the things Corinne and Raj have mentioned and Michael mentioned. We're looking at what offer is going to generate the best impact or have the most benefit for the local communities that we serve, that we ultimately look after. So looking at method statements as well, for example, that go hand in hand often with the number part of the offer. We'll do 5 of this, 6 of that, X amount of pounds, blah, 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 blah. But actually hearing from you, okay, how are you going to do that? How are you going to generate these recruitment opportunities? How does that differ from Section 106 expectations? Are you going to be offering the real living wage? Are you, looking at all these different kind of elements to how your offer will be delivered and how it's built out? It's really, really important to us. Like I said, social value isn't a tick box, and we can always spot when someone has answered a question with that kind of mindset, like, oh yeah, let's just offer the most stuff. We're also going to look at, is it feasible? Has this person really thought about the length of the contract, looked at the sort of team they've got in place? Is this really realistically viable for the period in question? We do consider all of these things when we're scoring. I told you, we're experts, all of us, SVLG experts.
Actually, add another wee point to that. So I think it goes back to a point Nathan made during the session, and it's about social value is both large scale and kind of in real detail. So I think Chichi made this point a bit there, that actually the responsibilities on the social housing organisations following that through and being strict about it. And that's the bit where I think so much of social value we do anyway. It's just about capturing it. And actually, this is the bit that I would say is the kind of difficult part, making sure that you're holding the contractors to account. I mean, too long we've kind of blamed contractors in this game and saying they've not delivered social value. Actually, let's be clear on what we want and how to follow it through. And I think the way in which we do that is by understanding that local need part I spoke about, but also how does it fit in with previous question about larger agendas. So thinking about ESG or the UN Sustainable Development Goals, social value doesn't just sit with, in Social Value Week or with our organisations. It sits in a global context, and there's loads of framework and kind of strategic outlooks. And I think, looking at what are the outcomes in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, how can we map against those while also mapping against what our local tenant needs? And I think that's how we start to do that really well. And again, it just shows that the comprehension of social value and social housing is just huge.
Just to add to all of that, I think the bit that we've missed out in the kind of assessment of responses is also the tender interview stage. The reality is that what's written on paper is never the full story. So it's important that if you're scoring the tender question, you're also part of that tender evaluation team at the interview stage, because that's when you get to really break down what they've put in their tender submissions. That's where you get to ask the questions and get them to focus their minds on their responses, and you really get an insight. I've been in tender interviews where a question on paper looks fantastic. They failed to actually give me detail, and the opposite, on paper it looked quite weak, but they've really thought about it. So, for all of you that are listening, if you're not already on that interview panel system, it's not just about having it in the tender document and scoring that. It's also that follow-up in the tender interview stage that plays such a vital role. And once you do that, you find yourself scoring up or down accordingly. So do make sure you're there. And for those who are going to be on those panels in terms of answering our questions, please pay attention to what you put in your tender submissions. Make sure you've got that information ready on hand to give us the answers we're looking for, because coming in ill prepared for the social value bit, which is often what happens in these interview panels, actually does lead to you decreasing your score, because you kind of shame to us that you haven't valued social value, which, actually isn't a positive reflection on your organisations.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Next question. What advice do you suggest to housing associations to use social value to positively impact wider social issues? So not just employment training and apprenticeships. And how can they engage social enterprises to get to play a role? Adam, straight in there.
Thank you, Nikki. I think realistically, the way that housing associations can really help do this is literally have a look at your residents and find out what problems your residents are facing. Obviously, based on where you are. So if you're up in the Midlands, you're going to have completely different problems to someone that might be on the South Coast. Find out what you can do to help. So most housing associations will have a economic inclusion team, someone that will work on the jobs, training, employment you've just mentioned, but they will also be able to sort of talk about other issues. One of the big things that Peabody are doing at the moment is really looking at our ESG and our sustainability and all our impact on the economy in regards to sort of green issues. I think a lot of those green issues, that if we can start looking at being more sustainable, you look at projects that are sustainable, and you're already looking at projects that do feed into those quite a lot of the time. If you can have a community asset where you're able to take a piece of land that you've got, really make it into something like a community garden, where you can use it to then go on to do things like skills and employment, it kind of ticks both boxes. And it does go back to that, skills and employment to an extent. But actually what you're doing there is providing a sustainable space that is, you can use for a whole host of things. I've seen a number of housing associations up in Hertfordshire, where I live, who are putting in community gardens next to blocks of flats where you'd normally have sort of a fairly communal area that's not really used much, and they're creating it to grow food, so residents can go and tend to those plants and actually take the food and eat it. It's simple things like that are not only helping residents' lives, but actually helping them gain a skill and do other things that do kind of feed back to that skills, jobs and training. So if you are being led by skills, jobs and training, think about it and go, well, actually, how can I do something sustainable? And go the other way. If you are able to have a team that is able to make a real difference, and you don't need to look at skills, jobs and training, do also look at how that can feed back into it, because having the two together does really provide measurable benefits to our residents, and I think that's exactly what we're here for.
Just to add to that, I think Southern Housing was one of the first housing associations that kind of built social value into their approach and created the role. And when I first came in, my job title was social value, it was employment skills and development officer. And the focus really was, I think, right at the beginning, you're talking about 9 years ago, social value equated to employment and training. And I think within a year or so of working with the organisation, doing that culture change, trying to understand the need of our residents, it became very evident that if you focus solely on employment and training, very quickly you kind of lose so much more that's out there that your contractors can provide in communities. And the moment we opened up social value to have community impact, to have individual impact, to look beyond just the basic concepts of social value, actually the kind of innovation we were getting from our contractors, the kind of need we were meeting, became much more. And I've done a podcast with my colleagues John and Mark, which will be on site for the Social Value Leadership Group, and it talks about the social value impact in diverse communities. And the things that we're referencing in there is that evolution of social value. It's recognizing that we are living in such diverse communities. And every time we do a consensus, the one key thing that keeps coming out of that is how diverse Britain is and the wonderful cultures and the different types of need we have in our communities. And social value through our contractors, we can so rapidly understand what that need is and find targeted projects that can deliver that. So when you're writing your social value tender question, when you're marking them, you know, it's trying to be as broad as you can, because that's all you can do at a tender stage. The evolution comes when you're working with the contractors. It's getting that buy-in to actually work with you and evolve according to the need communities you're in. And that's where the impact comes from.
Chi Chi?
Add to that, thanks, Nikki. Yeah, I totally agree there with Raj and Adam. I think, Adam, you mentioned this earlier on. We're way beyond the days of a one apprentice per 1 million, and you know that does not a social value offer make. You know, we've moved on. People need to remember that social value is essentially anything that generates a social, economic, or environmental benefit for people and places. So the possibilities are just, you know, they're vast. One of the things that we're exploring at Hyde, and this kind of goes back to a point around supporting local organisations, is we are trying to see how can we use our relationships with our supply chain to essentially support MSMEs and VCSEs. You know, yes, as an organisation, we need to look at our own procurement policies and see how we can ensure that more of those sorts of organisations join our own supply chain. But then, as a kind of secondary step for someone like myself as a social value manager, it's looking at how can I then encourage our tier 1 contractors or our primary contractors to also consider taking on VCSEs and MSMEs as part of their supply chain, and working with organisations like Supply Change. So shout out to Beth and Isha, who vet these smaller organisations at social enterprises and so on, so that they're kind of ready and able to take on commercial contracts, you know, and have the same kind of be held at the same standard as anyone else. So I think there's definitely a piece of work that we can all do in ensuring VCSEs and MSMEs get more of a look in with regards to supply chains. Sorry.
I just have a 1 sentence to add to it, and I think it goes back to a point I made about working as community anchors or within communities. I think the other way that this can be delivered, and I think Adam touched on this, is through partnership working. So I think being present in our communities and working across different delivery partners, I think we're able to then look at kind of wider remit of outcomes rather than purely the kind of employability ones we spoke about.
Okay. I think that's it. Thank you. If anyone's made it to the end of listening to this bonus question session, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good day, guys.